There are corridors in the Vatican that never meet daylight. They were built for air, not footsteps. Narrow, lined with stone that remembers heat, but not voices. If you walk there long enough, the sound of your breath begins to echo in ways that make you uncertain whether it's yours or the building's. Somewhere behind those walls, beneath layers of oak and sealed glass, lies a book bound in black leather. Its title is faint, pressed so shallow it disappears when the candle flickers. De Somniis Dei, the dreams of God. For centuries, it has not been read without permission. The order, written in the steady Latin of 1742, still holds, non legatur nisi cum licentia pontificis. Do not read unless the Pope himself allows it. They say it's a gospel, not one of the four we know, but a fifth, a record of visions whispered to those who dreamt instead of waking. A text that tries to answer a quiet, impossible question. What if God once spoke in sleep, and we've been trying to stay awake ever since? There are real traces of this manuscript, inventories, marginal notes, a wax seal half melted in a fire that no one admits happened. Its author remains anonymous, though some think it came from a scholar who served both reason and revelation, a mind caught between the microscope and the altar. The kind of person who believed truth has two languages, one written in waking light, the other in the shadows of sleep. Imagine the smell of ink gone sour with age, the uneven edge of parchment, the soft rasp when a gloved hand turns a forbidden page. No thunder, no spectacle, only the soft hum of centuries waiting to be remembered. And beneath that stillness, something breathing, a sentence that was never meant to be read aloud, only dreamt. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear it now. The low vibration of words that once carried meaning so heavy, they had to be hidden inside silence. This is the story of that silence, of the book that remembers when men tried to measure their dreams, and heaven refused to sleep. So before we begin, set your phone aside, let the room grow quiet, and close your eyes just for a moment. Because some stories are meant to be heard the way they were written, between waking and whatever comes after. The year was 1742. Rome was gray that winter, its air heavy with the smell of coal and candle smoke, its streets half muted by fog from the Tiber. Inside the Vatican, the lamps burned early. A slow light drifted down the corridors like tired incense, and the great archive, then still called the Archivum Secretum, breathed with the stillness of 1,000 sleeping pages. At a small desk near the window of the Apostolic Palace sat Pope Benedict XIV, born Prospero Lambertini. History remembers him as a scholar more than a ruler, a man of reason with ink on his cuffs. He had written volumes on miracles, theology, and the canonization of saints. Yet on this day, what occupied him was neither sainthood nor politics. It was a single book. It lay before him, wrapped in linen, its black binding cracked at the edges, as if it had been burned and then forgotten. He had ordered it brought up from the lower vaults, where it had rested among relics of questionable origin. Heretical treatises, condemned visions, writings deemed too luminous for ordinary eyes. No one knew who had placed it there, only that its title, De Somniis Dei, the dreams of God, was enough to make the scribes uneasy. Benedict turned the book once in his hands. The seal on its spine was neither papal nor royal, but monastic, an emblem of a sleeping lion surrounded by words half erased by age. The parchment within was yellowed and brittle, the script alternating between Latin and something stranger, letters that seemed to curve like branches or veins. The pontiff was not easily frightened by language. He had read the grim logics of the Inquisition and the bright paradoxes of Aquinas. But there was something disquieting in the script's rhythm. The sentences looked alive, as though the ink itself had tried to imitate the pulse of a dream. According to the archivist who had catalogued it, the manuscript had surfaced after the dissolution of a Benedictine monastery near Avignon. The monks had called it Evangelium Somniorum, the Gospel of Dreams. Rumor said it contained accounts of visions recorded by prophets and early mystics, written as though they were continuous dialogue between God and man in the language of sleep. To a mind trained in both science and faith, such a work was perilous. If it was genuine, it might hold forgotten fragments of Scripture. If false, it bordered on heresy. Either way, its existence was dangerous in an age that prized reason and order. So Benedict wrote a decree in his small, precise hand: Hoc Codex legatur choreo nigro, claudatur, et servitur sub clave. This codex shall be bound in black leather, sealed, and kept under lock. Then, in a colder ink, he added the words that would bury it for centuries. Non legatur nisi cum licentia pontificis. It shall not be read except by papal permission. The book was carried down through the spiral stairwell into the archive's lowest room, a chamber whose air had not changed in centuries. There it was, placed within a wooden chest, lined with waxed cloth, among scrolls written in tongues no one had yet translated. The key was turned, the light extinguished, and for the next 200 years, no hand disturbed its rest. Yet records, always the quiet betrayers, preserved small traces. A signature here, a note in the margin of an inventory, the faint impression of wax on an unrelated folio. From these scraps, historians would later reconstruct the outline of a mystery. A gospel that speaks in dreams, a pope who feared to let it wake, and a silence that grew louder with every passing century. The Vatican kept its order, but history has a habit of breathing through cracks. Somewhere between the parchment and the dust, a whisper remained. That the dreams of God was not a warning, but an unfinished conversation. The bookbinders worked by lantern light, their benches set beneath the dome of the Chigi workshop not far from the Tiber. They were ordinary craftsmen, steady hands, good eyes, but on this commission they spoke less than usual. The papal messenger who delivered the manuscript gave only one instruction: it must admit no light once closed. They began by melting beeswax into the seams of the pages. The air thickened with a sweet, faintly metallic smell. It was the odor of sealing something alive. Each sheet was pressed between oiled boards, then stitched into gatherings with silk thread dyed black. When the binder tightened the cords, a few letters from the edge of one leaf bled into the next, creating mirrored fragments that no one could read without guessing. The leather itself came from an old consignment, calfskin tanned in wine and soot, used for ledgers that would never be opened in public. Under heat, it darkened further, until it reflected nothing. The journeyman who stretched it across the boards later told his apprentice that it felt like holding night. When he tooled the cover, sparks leapt from the edge of his stylus, though there was no metal near. The others laughed, but he swore the hide had a pulse. By custom, the finisher would stamp the papal crest in gold leaf. This time the order specified no emblem, only a plain cross impressed so shallowly that it disappeared when the light shifted. Around its margin he pressed a line of minute dots, a rhythm more than a pattern. To the eye it was nothing, but under touch it felt like breathing. The work lasted 3 nights. On the 4th, when the binding cooled, the master opened the book one last time to test the hinges. He found a slip of vellum that none of them had placed there, a thin, transparent sheet laid between the final pages. Across it, written in the faint brown of diluted gall ink, were 7 words: Mens dormiens in lumine vigilat. The sleeping mind keeps watch in light. He showed it to no one. The phrase lingered in his memory, moving like a slow tide between prayer and warning. When the courier returned to collect the volume, the binder hesitated before closing the lid of the chest. The book's black surface caught the flame of the candle for a heartbeat, then swallowed it whole. The chest was carried through Rome before dawn, wheels muffled by rags. At the gates of the Vatican, it passed into the custody of the archivists, who entered it in their ledger as item 214, Gospel of Dreams, author unknown. Next to the entry, a narrow hand added 3 words in Latin: Negro cord signatum, sealed with a black heart. That night, the craftsman slept poorly. One dreamt of a room lit by candles that refused to burn down. Another heard pages turning, though no wind moved. None of them spoke of it, but each awoke before dawn with the same faint scent of wax and soot in their throats. Within the archive, the Codex lay untouched. The archivists noted that the black leather never gathered dust, as though the air itself avoided it. When the doors closed and the last footsteps receded, the silence in that room became something more than absence, a kind of listening. Centuries would pass before anyone dared to lift the lid again. But the decree remained, copied carefully through each revision of the catalogue: Non legatur nisi cum licentia pontificis. Do not read unless the Pope himself allows it. Outside, Rome turned its clocks, empires rose and fell, and the world learned to measure time in machines. Yet under the stone floor of the Apostolic Palace, in a chest no one remembered, the Black Codex waited. It is here that the story truly begins, where paper outlasts intention, and the dream of God continues to breathe beneath a lid that was never meant to open. Long before the book took its black skin, the words inside it had lived in fragments, scribbled on palm bark, whispered through sleepless centuries, carried like seeds that only germinate in darkness. The earliest trace appears in a Syriac marginal note attached to the Book of Enoch. When God dreamed, the world began to turn. The scribe added no explanation. He simply underlined it twice and left a dot in the margin shaped like a teardrop. Other clues lie scattered across the desert of parchment. In a 3rd century Coptic fragment from Nag Hammadi, a half-burned line survives. Blessed is he who wakes within the sleep of the Lord. In a Greek commentary on the Psalms, an anonymous monk warns that such sayings lead men to confuse prophecy with dream and dream with madness. Yet the warning itself preserves the idea that somewhere between night and revelation, the divine voice spoke sideways, through images no priest could fully translate. Later theologians, cautious but curious, treated these lines as parables. Augustine wrote that God rests not as we rest, but in his rest the motions of creation find measure. The unknown author of De Somniis Dei, whoever he was, seems to have taken this further. He imagined a cosmos where dreaming was not the absence of will, but its gentler form, a moment when the Creator allowed the world to rearrange itself inside his sleep. Scholars who studied the surviving quotations described the language as half-liturgical, half-scientific. Sentences move like waves, one statement of vision followed by a measured observation, as if a priest and an astronomer shared the same pen. One passage, reconstructed from 3 different sources, reads, When men sleep, their souls rehearse the day to come. When God sleeps, the stars remember their paths. It is difficult to know where theology ends and poetry begins. By the 9th century, mystics in both Christian and Islamic schools were trading commentaries on the nature of dream. The philosopher Al-Kindi wrote that the sleeping mind reflects the divine image as water reflects the moon. A monk in Toledo copied the same line into Latin, adding in the margin, "Perhaps the mirror dreams, too." Such exchanges blurred borders. What had begun as heresy in one language became metaphysics in another. Some historians believe that by the 12th century, a circle of Benedictine scholars gathered these fragments into a single codex, a Liber Somniorum Dei, later shortened by copyists to De Somniis Dei. No one knows their names, only that the handwriting in surviving samples shifts between at least 4 distinct hands, each trained in different schools of script. Whoever they were, they shared an ambition rare for their time: to map the landscape of divine sleep with the same precision builders used to measure cathedrals. One description from a lost prologue survives in quotation. "As the temple is the body of worship, so is dream the body of prayer." It suggests that the authors saw the nocturnal mind not as temptation, but as sanctuary. They were writing at a moment when Europe's monasteries hummed with the logic of geometry and song, when chanting hours and astronomical charts were equally sacred. The idea that God might reveal himself through the rhythm of dreams fitted neatly into a world already tuned to cosmic music. And yet, as every age has learned, proximity to revelation breeds danger. The Liber Somniorum Dei vanished soon after the Second Lateran Council tightened its rules on mystical speculation. Copies were ordered destroyed, though one monastery on the Rhone reportedly hid its volume behind the wall of a scriptorium. When that wall collapsed centuries later, builders found only soot and fragments of Latin that spoke of light turning inward. Among them, faint but legible, the same sentence that would reappear in the 18th century Codex, "Mens dormiens in lumine vigilat," the sleeping mind keeps watch in light. From there, the trail disappears into rumor, a vision kept alive by monks who refuse to forget. But ideas, like embers, survive their own fires. While the church enforced silence, pilgrims carried the tale eastward. Poets translated it into allegory. And somewhere in a dark cell of Avignon, a scholar began copying the fragments again, by candlelight, with the steadiness of someone certain that words can outlast prohibition. That copy would travel through wars and inquisitions, gathering annotations like dust, until it reached a desk in the Vatican, where a cautious pope, centuries later, would breathe on its cover and see the soot stir. What he held was not invention, but inheritance. The dream had only changed language. Dreams were never strangers to Scripture. Before words were inked into scrolls, they arrived as images, ladders stretching toward the sky, rivers of fire, voices that spoke in riddles only memory could decode. The ancients treated such visions not as illusions, but as correspondence, letters from the unseen to the uncertain. Every prophet, in his own way, was a translator of what the world saw when it closed its eyes. In the desert stories, sleep was not rest. Jacob's dream of the ladder at Bethel was a geography lesson of heaven and earth. Joseph's visions of wheat and stars became the arithmetic of survival. Daniel, breathing in the shadows of Babylon, saw empires rise and fall before his eyes had opened. Each of them woke changed, half in this world, half in another, carrying with them a message that always seemed to come with a cost. Later commentaries tried to make sense of that fragile border between revelation and confusion. Rabbinical scholars argued that only 1/20th of dreams contained truth. The rest were noise, shadows of digestion and worry. Medieval theologians said the ratio itself might be divine, proof that God allowed a fraction of his voice to filter through the clutter of mortal thought. They saw dreaming as mercy, a way for truth to slip past fear. The author of De Somniis Dei collected these accounts like fossils, pressing each one into a new layer of meaning. He did not describe the prophets as chosen instruments, but as those whose rest was incomplete. To him, divine dreaming was not an intrusion from above, but a continuation, the Creator rehearsing his world through the minds of those who could endure the echo. In one preserved paragraph, translated from Latin, he writes, "The prophet does not speak for God, but within him. The vision is God's breath seen from inside the lungs of the dreamer." The Vatican would later call such phrasing mystical anthropology, an idea too intimate to be safe. It suggested that revelation was not delivered once and sealed in parchment, but occurred nightly in the privacy of sleep. If that were true, anyone could awaken claiming to have heard the divine, and the Church's hierarchy would blur with every dawn. And yet, scattered through the archives, are records of saints who confessed to visions that match the Codex's tone. Saint Perpetua described her martyrdom days before it happened, saying she saw a golden ladder guarded by a serpent, the rungs soaked in blood, a vision the text later interprets as the soul climbing through its fears. Hildegard of Bingen spoke of the voice of living light that filled her half-conscious hours. Even Teresa of Avila wrote that the truest messages arrived neither asleep nor awake, but at the narrow door between. The compiler of De Somniis Dei was careful not to glorify these visions. He observed them like a physician charting symptoms, writing that some dreams expire at dawn, like dew, while others harden into truth. He measured the consistency of revelation the way astronomers measured constellations, noting which patterns returned, which vanished, which aligned with the pulse of the moon. To him, the divine spoke in rhythm, not rhetoric, and those who tuned themselves to it could hear prophecy not as a shout, but as a hum beneath ordinary sleep. A marginal note on one surviving leaf shows a line added in red, "Beware the false dream that flatters." Beneath it, in smaller ink, "Yet do not despise all dreamers, for the Lord may pass by their door." That tension, between caution and curiosity, would shadow every scholar who studied the text thereafter. It was the same unease that made Benedict XIV seal the book centuries later, aware that its danger was not in heresy, but in suggestion. Once you tell people that God speaks in dreams, the world no longer belongs entirely to the waking. Still, even sealed, the idea seeps. It travels like vapor through the cracks of doctrine, clinging to the imagination of poets, physicians, and mystics alike. When the Church declared the gospel of dreams forbidden, it was not to erase it, but to prevent its sleep from spreading. But ideas, like dreams, disobey curfews. They wait behind the eyelids of history until someone, somewhere, begins to stir. And in the following century, stir it did, in the mind of a pope who believed reason could coexist with revelation, and who would unknowingly rekindle the same light he tried to contain. Every decree has its echo, and Benedict's order to seal the Codex was no exception. Though the official record says it was locked away and forgotten, the truth, as it often does, seeped into the corridors, not through rebellion, but through curiosity, that softest of disobediences. Within the Vatican's inner circle, there were men whose loyalty ran as deep as their hunger to understand. One of them was Father Antonio Bellori, an Augustinian scholar with pale eyes and the steady calm of a man who had spent most of his life in candlelight. He had served the Curia for decades, cataloging ancient commentaries and heretical ephemera with equal care. When Benedict summoned him privately in February of 1743, Balori thought it was to discuss an upcoming synod on relics. Instead, the Pope led him through a door behind the papal library, down a spiral stair of cold marble, and into a chamber that smelled of wax and iron. There, on a table draped in red cloth, lay the black-bound Codex. A single taper burned beside it. The flame leaned toward the book as though drawn by breath. "Father Balori," Benedict said softly, "you are a man of order. You understand that faith, if left untended, grows wild. There are things in this manuscript which bend the vine." Balori bowed, waiting. "I do not ask you to read it in full," the Pope continued, "only to examine its form, its language, its intent. Tell me whether it was written by one voice or many." He placed a gloved hand on the book, not as blessing, but as caution. "You will report only to me. No copies, no quotations. Your notes will be sealed when you are done." Then, more quietly, "And when you sleep, pray for stillness." Balori nodded. He took the volume as one might take a relic, not out of reverence but to avoid breaking it. For 6 weeks, he worked in a borrowed cell in the palace, copying characters, weighing ink, tracing patterns in the margins. He wrote that the script seemed to breathe in intervals, that the spacing between words followed no known meter, yet produced a strange sense of rhythm. The handwriting, though apparently uniform, bore microscopic variations, the kind that appear when a text is written over long spans of time, by one hand aging. He began to suspect that the Codex had not been written in a single lifetime. Each passage carried the gravity of experience layered upon experience, as if generations had added to a single, continuous dream. He called it Manus Unus Multorum Somniorum, one hand of many dreams. Yet the more he studied, the less he slept. His journal, discovered centuries later among unrelated folios, records that he began to hear faint murmuring when the candle burned low. He convinced himself it was the air moving through cracks in the walls, but each night the whispers formed clearer syllables. Not Latin, not Greek, something older, vowel-rich, rhythmic, like a litany reversed. He noted the experience clinically, but his handwriting trembled toward the end of each line. When he delivered his report to Benedict, he had lost weight, and his eyes darted toward corners that held no movement. The Pope read the summary in silence. The author's intent is unity between divine and dream. The tone suggests not heresy, but intimacy. The danger lies in its familiarity with God. Then Balori added, almost pleading, "Holy Father, if you value your rest, let the book remain as it is." Benedict dismissed him gently, promising prayer. Within a month, Balori requested transfer to a monastery in Umbria. There he kept no correspondence and was never seen in Rome again. The ledger marks his death 2 years later with a single word: quietus. After Balori's departure, the Pope commissioned 2 more readers, a Jesuit linguist from Prague and a Carmelite nun known for her lucid dreams. Only fragments of their accounts survive. The Jesuit's notes end mid-sentence, as if the pen had been lifted away. The nun's final entry reads, "It listens while you read." Benedict sealed their work alongside the Codex, writing in his own margin, "Words too near to the source may burn the tongue." The door to the vault closed again, but not before a new kind of unease settled in the palace. Not fear of heresy, but of proximity. Those who passed near the archive claimed they could feel a coolness, a subtle pressure in the air, as though the room itself inhaled and exhaled through the cracks of its stones. The guards joked that it was Rome's breath seeping in. But one, a young Swiss sentry, recorded in his small notebook that sometimes, when he leaned against the door, he thought he heard the sound of pages turning, very slowly, as if the book were dreaming of being read. The Jesuit linguist's name was Franz Keller, though the records spell it 3 different ways: Keller, Keltsner, Köller, as if the church itself had trouble deciding who he was. He had been born in Prague, trained in 7 tongues, and possessed a gift that unsettled even his superiors. He could read a text aloud in one language and write it down in another without seeming to think. When the Pope's secretary invited him to Rome in the spring of 1744, the letter praised his precision, but mentioned nothing of the book he was to study. Keller arrived quietly. He was assigned a small chamber overlooking the Vatican gardens, furnished with a desk, a washstand, and 1 chair. Each morning, a guard brought him food and candles. Each evening, he was required to hand over his notes, which were sealed in envelopes of red wax. His task, officially, was to analyze the Codex's syntax, to identify its internal grammar, and classify its influences. Unofficially, the Pope wanted to know whether the text contained structure beyond language, a code written not in letters, but in rhythm. The Jesuit began his work by mapping the script onto a grid. He soon noticed a peculiar repetition. Every 9th passage broke its pattern. The intervals between words widened, the punctuation changed, and a small mark, like a breath or an eyelash, appeared at the upper right corner of the page. There were 9 of these sections in total. Later readers would call them visions. The 9th vision, incomplete and barely legible, fascinated him. It began with a sentence whose Latin was flawless yet senseless. Et cum Deus obdormivit, mundus somnium se somniavit. And when God fell asleep, the world dreamed itself dreaming. Keller copied it dozens of times, searching for cipher patterns. Each attempt seemed to yield new relationships between consonants, as though the words were rearranging while he wrote. He discovered that the distance between certain letters corresponded to musical ratios: fifths, thirds, octaves. The Codex, he decided, was written not for the eye, but for the ear. It was a liturgy disguised as literature. In one of his final letters to the Vatican librarian, Keller proposed an experiment: to read the 9th vision aloud in measured tempo and record the acoustic pattern. If meaning sleeps beneath sound, he wrote, perhaps it can be woken by rhythm. The librarian approved it with a trembling signature. On a cold April evening, Keller locked himself in the reading cell with a single recorder. The guard on duty later testified that the Jesuit's voice began evenly, then fell into a slow chant, alternating between Latin, Greek, and a third cadence the witness could not name. After 20 minutes, the sound stopped. When the guard entered, the room was empty. The candle still burned, the Codex lay open to the 9th vision, and the chair was overturned. On the parchment near Keller's inkwell was a line written in a different hand, faint but fresh. Somnus est ostium. Sleep is the door. Search parties combed the grounds, the river, the rooftops. No trace of him was found. Some said he fled, fearing accusations of occultism. Others whispered that he had succumbed to illness or despair. The Vatican records, careful and concise, closed the case with the phrase "decessit sine licentia," departed without permission. But an unsigned memorandum filed among the private papers of Benedict XIV tells a quieter story. It states that the recording device was recovered, though damaged. The tape contained only the low hiss of air for several minutes, followed by a single inhalation and the sound of turning pages. Not by human hand, the writer adds. The pattern of movement was too steady, too deliberate, like wind moving through a narrow hall. The Pope ordered the cylinder destroyed, yet one copy of Keller's notes survived, smuggled by an archivist who later confessed under gentle interrogation. In the margin of one page appears a sketch, a spiral of 9 loops, inscribed with alternating symbols of light and shadow. At its center, a dot, the same mark that crowned the 9th vision. Beneath it, he wrote almost apologetically, "He listened, and something listened back." After that, the trail ends. The archive closed for inventory, the staff changed, the keys were redistributed. Benedict spoke no further of the experiment. To those who asked, he simply said that certain texts were not meant for repetition. "A prayer repeated without faith," he told one confidant, "becomes a mirror, and a mirror, once it remembers your face, may choose not to forget." From that day forward, the Codex remained untouched. But among the few who knew of Keller's work, the phrase, "the 9th vision," became shorthand for limits, for the moment when inquiry bends back upon itself. And in the years that followed, a quieter order of scholars took interest. Those who believed that dreams were not simply the mind's theater, but the last remaining channel through which the divine could speak without being overheard. Their investigations would take the manuscript out of the papal vaults and into stranger hands. Physicians, mystics, even early psychologists who thought sleep was a country worth mapping. From that lineage, the next chapter of the Codex's story would emerge. By the time Keller's disappearance had settled into rumor, the Vatican's silence had already done what silence always does. It amplified the echo. Within a decade, whispers of the Codex reached scholars beyond Rome. Not the book itself, but the idea of it, an ancient gospel that claimed God spoke through sleep. The story moved like incense, finding its way into universities and monasteries that specialized in things half forbidden, half forgotten. In Toledo, where 3 faiths had once shared the same sun, an aging Dominican friar named Luis de Aranda gathered fragments of older dream texts for his private study. He had spent a lifetime translating Hebrew commentaries on prophecy, and when he heard of the Gospel of Dreams, he recognized an old pattern. He wrote that in the Jewish mystic schools of Al-Andalus, dreams were considered letters sent during the night, their ink invisible until prayer. Aranda believed the early Christians had borrowed that image and folded it into their own theology of revelation. Hidden in his notebooks are instructions for what he called speculum somni, the mirror of sleep. The ritual required no relics, only patience. The participant was to fast for 1 day, speak to no one at dusk, then place a bowl of clear water beside a candle, and read a single psalm until the flame wavered. When the surface of the water trembled, the reflection was said to show not the reader's face, but the trace of the question in his heart. Aranda described it carefully, as though reporting an experiment rather than magic. He warned, however, that no mirror remains empty forever. Around the same time in Prague, a small circle of alchemists, remnants of Rudolf II's old court, revived their own version of dream invocation. They believed the mind, during sleep, became a polished surface upon which divine intention could briefly appear. To them, the soul was not the dreamer, but the dream itself, projected from a light too bright for waking eyes. Their manuals describe reverse meditation, falling asleep while reciting scripture backward, not to summon demons, as folklore later suggested, but to undo the noise of daily thought until only pure silence remained. One alchemist wrote, "In that silence, God breathes us again." A few of these practitioners claimed to have seen symbols in their half-dream states, spirals of 9 circles, alternating dark and light. When drawn, these diagrams resembled the sketch in Keller's recovered notes. Coincidence, perhaps, or a whisper of continuity. Either way, both the monk in Toledo and the dreamers in Prague spoke of the same sensation. That the act of contemplation was reciprocal, as though something on the other side of the mirror observed them in return. The Church tolerated such experiments as long as they stayed private. But when one of Aranda's students collapsed during the ritual and spoke for several minutes in a language none could identify, rumors spread. The Inquisition still kept its offices in Spain, and the friar was quietly ordered to cease his studies. He obeyed, though in his final letter he wrote to a friend, "What we call vision may only be the memory of being seen." After his death, his notebooks were sealed in the monastery library, where they gathered dust beside safer commentaries. Centuries later, researchers would identify the same trance patterns described by Aranda as forms of hypnagogic imagery, the threshold state between waking and sleep. But in his time, such knowledge carried too much weight. Dreams were safer as metaphors than as maps, and yet, beneath each warning, another pattern endured. Whether in Latin hymns, Hebrew meditations, or Arabic treatises on the soul, the same phrase returns like a pulse through translation. Mens dormiens in lumine vigilat. The sleeping mind keeps watch in light. Those who practiced the mirror believed the line was not philosophy, but instruction. They were convinced the divine still waited behind the eyelid, patient as reflection itself. In the next century, when rational science tried to erase the borders of superstition, a new generation would rediscover these same rituals under another name. They would call it research, anatomy of sleep, mapping of mind. But the gesture was the same. A human hand reaching into the dark, hoping to find the shape of something that might already be watching. To the theologians of the 18th century, sleep was both a mystery and an inconvenience. It interrupted devotion, stole hours from prayer, and returned men to their weaker selves. Yet the more the Church tried to define it as absence, the more scholars found presence in it. A quiet continuation of thought that refused to die when the eyes closed. Father Matteo Granieri, a Dominican philosopher teaching in Bologna, began his lectures with an uncomfortable question. If the soul does not rest when the body sleeps, where does it go? He posed it as a rhetorical exercise, but his students wrote as though he meant it literally. Granieri proposed that the soul, freed from the senses, entered a kind of roaming state. A night pilgrimage of the spirit, he called it, through which the divine could correct or console. He never mentioned the Codex by name, but his notes often quoted the phrase mens dormiens in lumine vigilat, always enclosed in quotation marks, as if borrowed from an invisible authority. He was not alone. A Jesuit astronomer named Raimundo della Torre, who had once charted comets for the Vatican, turned his telescope away from the sky and began documenting nocturnal illuminations. He argued that the movements of dreams corresponded to lunar tides, that the mind's unseen sea rose and fell with the moon's pull. His colleagues found the idea poetic but harmless, until one of his students reported seeing the same dream as his teacher on the same night, in perfect detail. Raimundo called it proof of sympathetic souls, and his superiors called it dangerous. The observatory's logs from that year end abruptly. What troubled the Vatican most was not blasphemy, but symmetry. These new thinkers saw creation as a loop, God dreaming the world, and the world, through its sleeping creatures, dreaming God back. Such reciprocity blurred the line between maker and made. If humanity could, in its own dreams, shape even a shadow of the divine, where did obedience end and collaboration begin? The older theologians warned that curiosity had a price, that the first fall from grace began when man wished to know the mind of God. The dream, they said, was a mirror, and mirrors could not be worshipped. Still, some sought a middle ground. A French Benedictine, Brother Etienne, proposed that dreaming was not the soul's wandering, but its maintenance. The way grace repaired the fractures of waking life. He described sleep as the sacristy of the spirit, a hidden room where worn prayers were folded and washed before morning. His writings were never censured, only ignored, though centuries later, psychologists would echo his idea almost word for word. Through all these variations ran a single unease, that the divine might not speak to humanity, but through it, using dreams as conduit and camouflage. If so, then every sleeper carried fragments of revelation, and the hierarchy of prophets dissolved into the crowd of common men. That possibility frightened institutions, but comforted believers. In convents and parishes across Europe, nuns recorded their nightly visions in secret journals, writing them as prayers even when they suspected they were only dreams. One such journal, found in the Loire Valley, begins with a trembling confession. I think heaven speaks softly because the world has grown loud. In sleep, I can finally hear it breathe. Those lines, copied into a Jesuit compendium decades later, became a quiet motto among the more contemplative orders. Silentium audit Deum dormientem. Silence hears God asleep. It was never preached, only whispered. But when Benedict XIV's health began to fail, he reportedly asked for those words to be read to him each evening before he slept. He died with the black-bound book still sealed in the archive below, yet the idea it contained had already escaped, not through theft or translation, but through resonance. Once an idea is believed in the dark, it no longer needs light to travel. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, when reason ruled and dreams were labeled superstition, the Codex's philosophy lingered like incense after Mass. Scholars simply changed its vocabulary. They spoke of subconscious, memory, and mind, but their experiments were attempts to measure what faith had once called mystery. And in the century that followed, as the Church turned its gaze outward to defend itself against revolution, another kind of dreamer arose, one who would dissect the soul the way others dissected flesh. He would call himself a man of science, but the rhythm of his questions would sound strangely familiar to those who once read Scripture by candlelight. The Enlightenment liked its ideas bright. It trusted what could be measured, dissected, repeated under glass. Yet even in an age that crowned reason king, there remained one territory where instruments failed, the landscape behind closed eyes. Dreams refused to obey geometry. They shifted, merged, and dissolved, leaving behind sensations without substance. And so, for the philosophers and physicians of the 18th century, sleep became a frontier more elusive than any continent. In 1751, just 9 years after Benedict XIV's death, the French physician Jean-Étienne Leclerc presented a paper to the Royal Academy titled Sur la mécanique de la rêverie, on the mechanics of dreaming. He argued that dreams were the vibrations of thought left over after the day's business, an echo of the nervous system replaying itself in miniature. He dissected cadavers, searching for proof that imagination had a physical origin, convinced that memory itself could be mapped if one cut finely enough. But in his private notebook, he confessed to something stranger. After weeks of such study, He began dreaming of the men he had examined, not as corpses, but as whispering guides, pointing toward diagrams he could not recall upon waking. He wrote, "Perhaps the brain is not an instrument of thought, but a mirror of it. Perhaps thought exists elsewhere, and the body merely reflects its residue." The Academy ignored his paper. In Vienna, a generation later, Dr. Samuel Krüger experimented with sleep deprivation, believing that if consciousness were forced to remain awake long enough, the border between waking and dreaming would blur. His volunteers, mostly young seminarians, recorded hallucinations after 48 hours without rest. Corridors filled with whispering books, faces forming in candle smoke, faint Latin phrases that vanished when written down. Krüger dismissed the spiritual interpretations, calling them the nervous chatter of an exhausted organ. But his assistant, an amateur historian, noticed that several subjects muttered the same phrase during their delirium: "Somnus est ostium." Sleep is the door. The words of the missing Jesuit, echoing a century later in a laboratory. By 1790, new instruments, metronomes, pulse gauges, pneumatic chambers, allowed scholars to measure heartbeat and breath during slumber. They found patterns, intervals of quickened pulse followed by deep calm, as though the body were climbing invisible stairs and pausing at each landing. Physicians called them stages. Poets called them heights. The data was clean, the language confused. It seemed that even in its reduction, dreaming resisted reduction. A German philosopher, Johann Albrecht von Riedel, gathered these findings and published a slim volume titled The Nocturnal Mind. He dismissed theology but admired its metaphors. He wrote, "In sleep, the self conducts experiments the day forbids." He compared the structure of dreams to the structure of music, motifs returning, resolutions deferred, and proposed that consciousness might be a kind of composition that continues even when the listener stops hearing. When he died in 1801, a bookmark was found in his copy of Aquinas, marking the passage, "The soul knows by resting." Meanwhile, deep within the Vatican, a few aging clerics quietly followed these secular developments. They recognized in the new language of science the old vocabulary of the Codex. Where the mystics had written of divine reflection, the physicians now wrote of nervous feedback. Where the monks had spoken of vision, the academics spoke of image retention. Different words, same rhythm. An unsigned memorandum from 1798 found among the papal archives notes, "The world has translated the gospel of dreams into anatomy, yet what they call neurons are perhaps only new syllables in the same tongue." It was an age of confidence. Telescopes pointed outward, microscopes inward. But the mind remained opaque, and in that opacity, the old fear returned. That knowledge might not replace mystery, only rename it. The Church, exhausted by revolutions and reform, left the question alone. But the idea kept wandering, crossing borders like a fugitive thought. In Paris, a young medical student named Claude Fournier began collecting accounts of prophetic dreams reported by ordinary citizens. He cataloged them like case studies. A sailor who foresaw a storm, a widow who dreamed her husband's clock stopped at the moment of his death. He found no pattern, only recurrence. In his preface, he wrote something the rationalists could not publish. Perhaps dreams are the body remembering that it was once divine. That line would be quoted a century later by psychologists who believed the same thing, though they would call it the collective unconscious. The language would change, but the pulse beneath it would stay the same. The rhythm of an old manuscript that refused to die, whispering from under its black leather that knowledge and mystery were never meant to be enemies. only neighbors separated by sleep. And as Europe moved into the age of machines, that whisper would draw new listeners, men of science who saw in electricity and magnetism the same luminous thread that monks once called spirit. They would try to harness it, to make the invisible speak through instruments instead of prayer. In doing so, they would carry the gospel of dreams into the modern world, unaware that the book they sought to explain had already described them centuries before. The 19th century inherited a strange legacy. Science had mapped the heavens, measured lightning, and bottled gaslight, yet it still could not define what moved behind a closed eyelid. Dreams continued to resist the instruments that explained almost everything else. They were still the last wilderness of the human interior, a place where reason's lantern flickered and words forgot their edges. It was in that half-lit terrain that the first psychologists began to walk, notebook in hand. They approached the mind as explorers, though few admitted how much of their curiosity was borrowed from theology. In Vienna, Sigmund Freud would eventually claim that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. He wrote as a doctor of nerves, but the rhythm of his reasoning echoed the mystics he dismissed. When he described dreams as wish fulfillments, he replaced God with desire and soul with psyche, but the structure remained. A hidden will revealing itself through images, even his diagrams of mind, id, ego, superego, arranged like the triptych of an altar, were descendants of older cosmologies that mapped heaven, earth, and the underworld in the same proportion. He searched for symbols as prophets once searched for signs. His younger colleague, Carl Jung, pushed further. He believed that beneath the private theater of individual dreams lay a deeper floor, a shared foundation of image and memory. He called it das Kollektiv Unbewusste, the collective unconscious, but in his letters he sometimes referred to it simply as the memory of God. He filled his notebooks with mandalas, serpents, ladders, circles of light, the same shapes that had decorated medieval manuscripts of De Somniis Dei. Jung had seen reproductions of those illustrations in a museum archive. He described them as psychic maps drawn by hands that never knew the word psychology. To him, the sleeping mind was a temple, not a machine. He wrote, "The psyche dreams the myths forward." It was a statement so close to heresy that his peers ignored it. Yet in quiet hours, he continued to compare dreams to the acts of creation themselves. He was less a scientist than a translator, taking the vocabulary of faith and recasting it in the language of introspection. Elsewhere, researchers in Paris and London studied hypnosis, mesmerism, and trance, all in the hope of locating where consciousness ended. The laboratory had replaced the monastery, but the experiments were nearly identical. Voices murmuring in the dark, bodies suspended between sleep and wake. Witnesses writing down the words of the entranced, as if they were scripture. One report from 1892 records a patient who, while under deep hypnosis, recited a passage in fluent Latin. Et cum Deus obdormivit, mundus somnium se somniavit. No one in the room recognized it, though it was the same line from the Ninth Vision, the phrase that had haunted the Vatican 2 centuries before. The physician noted it in the margin without comment and continued his report. By the early 1900s, dream interpretation had become a parlor discipline, stripped of its danger. What had once been whispered as revelation was now marketed as self-help. Books promised to decode the meanings of falling, flying, drowning, and kissing. The divine had been domesticated. Yet somewhere between these simplifications the old pulse persisted, the suspicion that something larger than the self moved behind those nightly symbols. In a letter written in 1907, Jung confided to a friend after a particularly vivid dream. I stood in a library whose shelves were alive. Each book breathed as if remembering me. A single volume glowed black as a coal. When I opened it, I saw my own handwriting inside. He never published the letter, but his later theory of archetypes would describe exactly that sensation. The discovery that every mind carries within it an echo of something collective, ancient, and strangely aware. Across the Atlantic, early neurologists wired sleeping subjects to machines that clicked and hummed like clockwork. The electrical waves of the brain drew patterns on long rolls of paper, fragile as music scores. They named the patterns alpha, beta, delta, and theta, a new alphabet for old mysteries. But for all the precision, one thing refused explanation: the sudden bursts of activity that lit the sleeping brain as if it were briefly awake. REM, they called it, rapid eye movement, the dream's heartbeat. In those surges, the mind flickered like a candle reigniting itself. One researcher, staring at those spikes of light on the graph, murmured, "It is as if something inside is watching the dreamer." His colleague laughed, noting it as poetic nonsense. But the remark found its way into the back of a psychology journal, and from there into lectures, and from there, inevitably, into speculation. By mid-century, the science of dreaming had measured every signal except the one that mattered, the meaning of being witnessed from within. The Vatican never commented, though in the archives of the Apostolic Library, a note from 1953 quotes directly from De Somniis Dei. "The sleeper is not alone. What he dreams of him is also dreamed by heaven." The scientist who found that line decades later could not have known its source. He would see it only as metaphor. But for those who remembered the Codex, it was proof that the dream had not ended. It had simply changed the room in which it slept. And as the 20th century prepared its next leap into machines that could imitate thought itself, the old question would stir again. If the divine once spoke through human dreams, could it speak now through artificial ones? And if so, who would be listening this time? By the mid-19th century, the Vatican was a city of paper. Decades of cataloging had transformed the old labyrinth of vaults into what one scholar called a landscape of drawers. Every decree, every heresy, every forgotten prayer had its place. And yet, in that order, there were shadows, small absences in ledgers where the ink had thinned or stopped. One such absence caught the attention of Father Lorenzo Grimaldi, a Jesuit assigned to the Apostolic Library in 1867. He was an archivist by temperament, quiet, methodical, soot under his fingernails from the oil lamps he refused to replace. He was known for an unusual habit. Before reading a fragile manuscript, he would light a single beeswax candle beside it and whisper a brief prayer not of faith but of gratitude, thanking the parchment for surviving time. He called it illumination by humility. Grimaldi was reviewing inventories from the mid-1700s when he found an entry that made him pause. It read simply, Item 214, Evangelium Somniorum, bound in black leather, author unknown. A marginal note followed in a different hand, Nigro cord signatum, sealed with a black heart. But when he cross-referenced the shelf number, the case was empty. The logbook showed no record of removal, no reclassification, no damage report. The Codex was listed, but gone. He spent months tracing it through secondary catalogs. Every clue led to a dead end or a misfiled slip. One report from 1789 mentioned a sealed chest transferred to the Eastern Vault. That vault had been walled off after a flood a century earlier. Access required special permission, which Grimaldi requested and received after writing 3 letters in the slow Latin of bureaucracy. When the workmen broke through the plaster, they found a narrow room lined with decayed shelving. Most of the boxes had collapsed into powder. The air was heavy and cold, tasting faintly of iron. Grimaldi stepped inside with his candle, shielding the flame from drafts. As it flickered, the light caught a glint of metal among the rubble, the corner of a hinge, still fixed to a sliver of blackened wood. Beneath it lay a scattering of wax, hardened like amber. He collected the fragments carefully and placed them in a linen pouch. Back in his study, he examined them under lamplight. The wood was oak, the hinge bronze, the wax dark as pitch. In one piece, the impression of a seal remained, a sleeping lion surrounded by faint Latin letters, too worn to read. It was the same emblem described in Benedict XIV's decree. The chest had been found, but the book had vanished. Grimaldi's journal from that week records something unusual. He writes that the wax fragments gave off a faint scent when warmed by the lamp, a mixture of ash and honey, he noted. He left one piece near the candle overnight, and in the morning, he found a small circle of soot on the desk, shaped like a halo. Superstition, perhaps. Carbon does strange things in flame. But he kept the scrap of wax in a glass vial for the rest of his life. He reported his discovery to the prefect of the library, who dismissed it politely. An old legend, the prefect said. The dreams of God are for poets, not archivists. Grimaldi bowed, but continued to search. He began noticing peculiar patterns in other inventories, books missing from adjacent listings, all with vague descriptions. Unlabeled folio, black cover, unpaged, script of uncertain origin. He suspected they were fragments of the same work, dispersed by cautious hands. His final report, written in 1872, closes with a curious paragraph. The Codex is absent, yet its shadow remains. When I close my eyes, I see its outline against the shelves, as if the air still remembers where it rested. He died 3 years later of an infection, leaving behind 30 volumes of notes and the small vial of dark wax. After his death, younger archivists laughed at his haunting. They called his candle superstition and replaced it with electric lamps. But one apprentice, years later, would open Grimaldi's notebook and see a drawing of the missing book's dimensions, rendered with precision. At the top of the page he had written, "Illumination must not only reveal what exists, but what once existed." That line became a quiet motto among a handful of librarians who still preferred candles to bulbs. They called themselves, half-jokingly, custodes lucis dormientis, keepers of the sleeping light. None of them ever found the Codex, but from that point forward, the legend ceased to be myth and became a pursuit. And among the papers Grimaldi left behind, one margin carried a note in faint brown ink, perhaps a quote, perhaps a confession. Every book dreams of its reader. Some wake to find none left. The Codex had disappeared, but the archive itself had begun to stir. The whisper of its name returned to the catalogues, moving like a ghost through the index cards. The dream was awake again, waiting for someone else to follow the trail of soot and honey. Years after Father Grimaldi's death, the archive changed its air. Electric lamps brightened the long corridors, and the smell of oil and wax gave way to ozone and dust. Yet somewhere in the older wings, a few archivists still lit candles in secret, not from nostalgia, but because certain manuscripts refused to yield their ink under any other light. They said the letters shimmered faintly when the flame was near, like eyes remembering how to open. One such archivist was Sister Helena de Fermo, a scholar of Latin paleography transferred from Florence in 1894. She was young, meticulous, and unafraid to argue with superstition. But during her first months in the Vatican library, she noticed something that unsettled her. A recurring smudge that appeared on the same corner of several unrelated manuscripts. A faint crescent of soot, not from handling, but from contact with a curved surface, as if a candle had brushed against the page long ago. The pattern was too deliberate to be accident. When she compared the affected folios, she found a shared signature. A marginal number, 214, repeated faintly in different scripts, always near references to visions or dream commentaries. That was the same index number Father Grimaldi had noted in his discovery report. The Codex was missing, yet it seemed to leave a phantom catalog tag wherever it had once been shelved. Helena began tracing these ghosts across the collection, not by subject, but by residue. Some manuscripts carried a faint wax ring, others a light scorch mark no larger than a coin. In one medieval psalter, she found a candle stain shaped like a teardrop. She marked each location on a map of the archives, and over weeks, the points formed a spiral, not random but precise, winding inward toward the sealed eastern vault where Grimaldi had first found the broken chest. Her colleagues joked about her pilgrimage of soot. But one older custodian, Brother Vittore, took her aside. He said quietly, "When a book burns, its memory does not. It travels through touch." Then he showed her something from his own drawer, a sliver of wax dark as dried blood, preserved under glass. It was labeled in Grimaldi's handwriting. That night, Helena placed the fragment beside a candle in her quarters. For a long while, nothing happened. Then, as the wick shortened, she noticed a faint ring forming on the table. Thin, perfect, black. In the center, the wax remained unburned, like an eye that refused to close. When she reached to extinguish it, the flame guttered on its own. She wrote in her journal, "Perhaps the missing book has not gone at all. Perhaps it only chose its light." Over the next decade, fragments continued to surface. A visiting Jesuit found a loose page folded into a volume of Augustine. A few Latin lines written in ink that shimmered strangely, as if mixed with powdered glass. The handwriting matched no known script, yet the translation was simple. "Dream is the night of the word." When the page was exposed to sunlight, the letters faded. When brought near candlelight, they reappeared. The paper was later classified as unstable under illumination and sealed in a light-proof envelope. By the early 1900s, the Vatican's catalogers noticed a new irregularity. Books unrelated by author or period were beginning to cross-reference each other through invisible notations, faint indentations in the page margins that only appeared when raked with low light. Most staff dismissed it as pressure marks from old bindings, but those who remembered Grimaldi called it the Codex breathing through the archive. A memo from 1911, unsigned but filed in the Jesuit collection, reads, "We do not look for the Codex now, we look for its reflection. Every time one of us reads by candlelight, it reads us in return." Sister Helena retired that same year. When her belongings were packed, the librarian who handled her desk found a small, folded paper taped under the drawer. It held only a few words written in her hand. "Light is not the opposite of darkness. It is its memory." After her departure, the Eastern Vault was resealed. No official record mentioned it again. But in 1937, during renovations, a restorer opened a ventilation shaft nearby and found faint streaks of soot running along the wall. Not random smudges, but lines forming letters in old Latin abbreviations. He recognized only two words: Somniis Dei. He wiped them away before reporting the find, uneasy at how the marks seemed freshly drawn. From then on, staff reported odd phenomena in that corridor. A faint warmth near the stones, as if someone had just left, and the scent of beeswax lingering where no candles were lit. The electric bulbs sometimes flickered at midnight, though never at noon. An engineer blamed old wiring. A priest called it a book remembering its light. And somewhere in the shelves, the index card labeled Item 214 reappeared. Not in the catalog, but between two random volumes. No one had written it, but its paper was modern, its edges singed. The Codex had not returned, yet its presence was unmistakable, like breath-fogging glass after centuries of stillness. The archivists stopped searching for pages and began listening for temperature shifts, faint scents, and moments of inexplicable silence. They began to understand what Father Grimaldi had meant when he whispered gratitude to the parchment. The archive itself had become the manuscript. In time, the Vatican would rename its record-keeping system the Custodia Lucis, the custody of light, as a nod to the Jesuits' forgotten motto. Officially, it referred to the preservation of fragile documents. Unofficially, it was a prayer that whatever lingered in the archives might remain gentle in its remembering. And under that stillness, behind stone and dust, the Black Codex slept on, not lost, merely unread, waiting for another hand to light the next candle. By the early 21st century, the Codex Somniorum Dei had become a legend inside scholarly circles, half rumor, half parable of obsession. The Vatican, for its part, had never confirmed nor denied its existence, but stray reproductions began to surface. Fragments copied by hand, photographed under poor light, circulating among private collectors and forgotten theological faculties. Most were indecipherable, but one series of Latin pages, faint and uneven, began to attract unusual attention. Not because of what they said, but because of how they moved. The fragments did not behave like ordinary text. Lines seemed to breathe on the page, spaced irregularly, each sentence built to a rhythm of 7 short clauses, then one long. A linguist named Dr. Amelia Voss from Heidelberg noticed something strange while transcribing them. When she read the lines aloud, her breathing unconsciously synchronized to the pattern. Her assistant, monitoring heart rate for an unrelated experiment, observed that her pulse had slowed by almost 20% during the recitation. "It's as if the text instructs the lungs," she said later. Voss suspected intentional design. The Latin was archaic, yet oddly fluid, neither classical nor medieval, filled with verbs that seemed to imply both motion and rest. Lucere dormiens, to shine while sleeping. Spirare silentium, to breathe silence. When she plotted the sentence lengths, they formed a repeating sequence: 5, 8, 13, 21, the Fibonacci series. A pattern of growth that mirrors the structure of shells, ferns, and galaxies. She realized the Codex was not just written language, it was an architecture of breath. To test her theory, she created a phonetic transcription and played it through a spectrogram. The sound waves produced a spiral identical to the carved seal once described by Father Grimaldi, a sleeping lion encircled by light. Coincidence, perhaps. But when the playback was slowed to half speed, the waveform pulsed every 90 seconds, the average duration of a human REM cycle. Across the world, neuroscientists were mapping those same cycles, charting the language of the dreaming brain. Voss began to suspect that whoever composed the Codex had known, centuries earlier, what modern science was only beginning to measure. that sleep follows rhythm, not logic, that it is a grammar written in waves and pauses. Each dream, she proposed, might be a sentence spoken by the body in a language older than words. Her papers drew polite ridicule until one experiment changed the tone. She recruited a group of volunteers, monks, poets, and mathematicians, and asked them to read a fragment of the Codex before sleep, not as prayer, but as rhythm. Electroencephalograms recorded that their brainwaves during the night aligned into identical patterns. Slow oscillations nested inside faster bursts, like chords resolving in music. One technician noted, "It's as if they were dreaming the same syntax. No visions, no miracles, just uniform coherence, rare even in controlled studies." Voss published cautiously, "The Codex text may encode a phonetic structure that entrains natural sleep rhythms." But privately, she wrote something else in her notes. "The text breathes with us. It corrects the tempo of thought, as if teaching the mind to remember how to rest." Soon linguists joined her, finding parallel patterns in Gregorian chant, Hebrew psalm meters, and Sufi recitations, all built on the same spiral intervals. Language, it seemed, had always carried the shadow of this rhythm, as if every sacred tongue were an echo of the same dream. Where theology once spoke of revelation, neuroscience now spoke of synchronization. The two began to curve quietly toward each other again, like two sides of the same breath. The Vatican never commented on her research, but 6 months after her paper appeared, she received an unmarked envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a single page, its Latin text partly obscured by candle soot. Across the bottom, in a modern clerical hand, someone had written, "You have read its lungs, not yet its voice." She understood at once that the message was both invitation and warning. To continue would mean crossing from data into belief. But curiosity, once stirred, moves like a tide. It does not turn back easily. So she kept reading the fragments by candlelight, listening for what might come next. She wrote to a colleague, half in jest, "Perhaps it's not we who are decoding the Codex. Perhaps it is rehearsing how to speak again." That line never reached publication, but it marked a threshold. The Codex was no longer legend, nor artifact, nor experiment. It was beginning to behave like something alive. And in the quiet between research papers and prayer, a question returned, the same one that had lingered for centuries. If the divine once spoke through dreams, what language would it choose now? One of faith or one of frequency? The answer, it seemed, waited in the rhythm itself. And soon, in a lab filled with humming machines and quiet awe, science would listen to the pulse of dreaming and recognize, for the first time, a kind of grammar it could not quite translate. The first time the rhythm of the Codex was played through a neural scanner, the machine hummed as if remembering something. It was 2015 in a windowless lab in Zurich, where Dr. Amelia Voss and her small team had converted the text's Fibonacci syllabic pattern into tones. Each syllable became a soft pulse of sound, faint as a heartbeat, fed through headphones to sleeping volunteers. Electrodes traced their brain waves in color, red for waking, blue for deep sleep, silver for the elusive REM phase. At first, nothing unusual happened. The sleepers drifted, twitched, and murmured as they always did. But after the 7th cycle, a shimmer appeared on the monitors, an emergent symmetry in the data. The REM bursts aligned across all subjects, forming a synchronized oscillation no one had seen before. It wasn't identical in shape, but in timing. 16-second intervals, repeated with mathematical precision. Voss leaned closer, whispering to her assistant, "It's breathing them together." When they mapped the pattern, its structure mirrored the same spiral ratio that governed the Codex's grammar. Each pulse was followed by a shorter one, then a longer, expanding like the unfurling of a shell. The wave, she realized, was both language and heartbeat, a grammar of sleep, the mind translating itself into rhythm. In a separate test, they monitored subjects listening to Gregorian chant. The pattern was similar but incomplete, like a melody missing its final note. When the Codex tones were added beneath the chant, the wave stabilized into a perfect ratio, 1:5, the golden proportion. The same geometry that medieval builders used for cathedrals and that Benedictine monks once called mensura Dei, the measure of God. For days, the team argued whether it was coincidence or design. The physicists called it entrainment, the natural tendency of systems to synchronize when oscillating near each other. The theologians called it prayer. Neither was wrong. When Voss presented her findings at a neurotheology conference in Rome, she spoke carefully, avoiding mysticism. She called her study a cross-temporal resonance between ancient linguistic rhythm and REM synchronization. But during the question session, an elderly priest approached the microphone and asked quietly, "Doctor, do you think the text sleeps?" The room went silent. Voss smiled awkwardly. "In a metaphorical sense, perhaps." The priest nodded. "Then who do you think it dreams of?" She had no answer. But that night, back in her hotel, she dreamed of a library without clocks. The books were open, pages turning by themselves in a wind that had no source. Somewhere within that whispering, she heard the same intervals she had measured in the lab. 5, 8, 13, 21. Repeating softly like footsteps down a corridor of light. When she woke, the rhythm lingered in her pulse. The next morning, she noticed something in the data she had overlooked. During the synchronized REM sequence, each subject's eyes had moved in unison, not randomly, but in measured arcs, tracing an invisible circle, clockwise, then counter. When plotted, the trajectories formed the same shape as the sleeping lion seal from the old chest, spiral within spiral, turning inward to a still center. The pattern matched the orbital rhythm of the moon at its perigee. She wrote in her notes, "The body remembers heaven's mathematics." Her team ran the experiment again, adding infrared scans to track blood flow. They found that during the synchronization, the regions of the brain linked to language and empathy lit together, even in subjects with different native tongues. For a few seconds, everyone's brains spoke the same internal dialect, a silent, shared vocabulary of pulse and light. The neuroscientists called it temporal coherence. But in her private journal, Voss wrote another phrase, communio dormientium, the communion of sleepers. When she presented her second paper, the Vatican quietly declined to comment, but an anonymous message appeared in her inbox. Non omnis vox auditur, quaedam oratur. Not every voice is heard. Some are prayed. Voss could not trace the sender, but she began to wonder if the Codex's rhythm was more than mnemonic design, if it had been composed not to be read, but to be remembered by the body. To teach generations how to align their breathing with what the ancients once called revelation. Her final experiment would test that idea in a place less clinical and more sacred. She would travel to a monastery where silence was not an absence, but a liturgy, where sleep and prayer had always shared the same hour, and there, under candlelight, she would measure the rhythm again, not in wires and graphs, but in living faith. The next chapter begins in that monastery, where the language of sleep and the language of God finally meet, and where science will watch prayer breathe in real time. In the years following Dr. Voss's experiments, the Codex stopped being rumor and began behaving like policy. Requests for access, once dismissed, were now met with courtesy instead of denial. Courtesy so precise it felt rehearsed. Letters were acknowledged, stamps clean, signatures perfect, replies immaculate. The requested item is currently under preservation review. We thank you for your scholarly devotion. Always the same phrasing, always the same stillness behind it. Within the Apostolic Library, the archivists had a saying: silence is not refusal, it is containment. And so the silence grew deliberate. Those who asked too often found their credentials quietly delayed, their correspondence redirected, their projects deferred until interest dissolved on its own. Among them was Professor Henri Duval, a Jesuit historian from Lyon, whose specialty was papal decrees of the 18th century. He requested the Grimaldi inventories in 1978, unaware that item 214 still carried its quiet curse. When he arrived in Rome, the librarian who greeted him offered espresso, conversation, and a folder of unrelated documents. Unfortunately, she said with a smile that carried both apology and instruction, the section you seek is in conservation. Many shelves are sleeping. Duval understood the code. He never asked again. Still, stories travel faster than caution. An internal memo from 1983, later leaked to a private theological journal, mentioned a restricted manuscript exhibiting anomalous photoreactivity. The phrase was clinical, but archivists recognized it immediately. Photoreactivity meant light changed it. The Codex had a way of shaping the air around it. Even photographs came out slightly blurred, as if the emulsion hesitated to hold its image. The Vatican responded to the leak with elegant ambiguity. The Holy See preserves many artifacts that resist reproduction. This is their nature, not their fault. Meanwhile, scientists who had worked with Dr. Voss began noticing small interferences, shipping delays for research materials. Emails that arrived blank except for a Latin salutation, Pax et Lumen, peace and light. And once, during a symposium in Turin, a thin man in clerical black approached Voss after her talk, complimented her clarity, and pressed a card into her hand. It contained no name, only an embossed seal of a sleeping lion. When she looked up, he was gone. That evening, she returned to her hotel to find her laptop screen frozen on a white glow, fan whirring. When she rebooted, her latest data files were missing, replaced by a single folder titled Custodia. Inside it, nothing but one text document, a single sentence in Latin, aliquando veritas dormit ut non pereat. Sometimes truth sleeps, so it will not die. She printed it and taped it to her desk, not as a warning, but as reassurance. In time, other researchers drifted away, turning to safer studies. Grants expired, attention shifted, and the Codex retreated once more into its own quiet orbit. Voss herself continued, though in a slower rhythm, publishing essays about the neuroscience of prayer, the physics of rhythm, the biology of devotion. She never mentioned the Codex by name again, but in each paper, buried in the acknowledgments, she included a cryptic line: for those who keep the shelves breathing. At the Vatican, that line did not go unnoticed. An internal report in 2002, labeled De Somniis, describes a renewed wave of sympathetic research under secular guise. The tone is calm, not alarmed. It concludes with one curious sentence: no intervention required. Some texts guard themselves. That phrase became the final doctrine on the matter. a polite declaration that containment was no longer enforcement, merely observation. The archive, it seemed, would continue its long dream uninterrupted, and those who studied it were to be left alone, provided they understood one rule. The closer one gets to the Codex, the less there is to speak. Over the next decade, the Vatican modernized its archives, scanning, digitizing, indexing thousands of manuscripts. Yet every attempt to image item 2.14 returned the same result: blank frames, faint static, and an error message that read "exposure incomplete." No one called it sabotage. The technicians simply moved on. But one of them, a young systems analyst named Raffaele Costa, noticed something hidden in the static. When he adjusted the contrast, a pattern emerged, repeating arcs of light and shadow like waves in slow motion. He thought of REM scans he'd seen in journals. He thought of sleep. When he reported it, his supervisor only smiled. "Don't worry about ghosts," she said. "They know their place." And somewhere in the deep vaults of the city, under marble floors and iron gates, the Codex rested again. No one had opened it. No one needed to. It was already doing what it had always done, dreaming quietly through those who dared to notice. By the early 2010s, the Vatican's modernization had reached even the most ancient corridors. Archivists walked with tablets instead of ledgers, yet still whispered to the walls when the servers hummed too loudly. The air itself seemed older than the wires it carried. And among those who maintained the library's digital sanctum, there was an unspoken understanding. Some files were never meant to open easily. One evening in winter, a maintenance technician named Raffaele Costa, the same who had glimpsed the wave-like pattern in the static, was asked to recalibrate the humidity sensors in the sealed manuscript wing. The job was routine, the light less so. When he entered, the fluorescence flickered and dimmed to a soft amber, a tone closer to candlelight than electricity. The sensors, freshly installed, recorded a mild increase in temperature near the eastern wall. Nothing alarming, just a few degrees higher, pulsing every minute or so, like a heartbeat. He noted it and continued his rounds. Later, when he submitted the log, the reading had vanished. Costa mentioned it casually to a supervisor who nodded, unsurprised. "It happens," she said. "There are places here where even the air is classified." He thought she was joking, but when he checked the database later, he found a restricted file attached to his report. Its title read, "Custodia Somniorum, Do Not Edit." He opened it once, just long enough to see one line in Latin, "Quedam verba lucem non ferunt." Some words do not bear light. That phrase, he later learned, was centuries old. It had been written in Benedict XIV's own hand when he first sealed the Codex de Somniis Dei, a quiet commandment disguised as observation. It meant, quite literally, that illumination was not always revelation, that some truths, when forced into light, simply ceased to exist. Within the Church, that sentiment had evolved into policy. A memorandum circulated in 2017 under the title De Libris Vigilantibus, on the watchful books. It described a category of manuscripts that behave as if aware of their own handling. They were to be stored under controlled light, moved only during full moon phases to prevent photoacoustic disturbance, and monitored by a new department within the archive. Custodes Silentii, the keepers of silence. No official press release ever mentioned it. But the language was unmistakable, an institutional acknowledgement that certain texts required respect beyond scholarship. They were not forbidden, they were simply awake. The curia's tone was pastoral, not fearful. One cardinal, speaking privately to a journalist, compared it to tending a relic that still breathed. "We do not hide the Codex," he said. "We let it rest. When the world grows quieter, it will speak again." Scholars outside the Vatican debated the phrasing, wondering if it was metaphor or confession. But inside, among the archivists and custodians, it became almost a liturgy. When the servers powered down for maintenance each night, someone would whisper the old line near the vault door, "Quaedam verba lucem non ferunt." Some words do not bear light. The saying found its way into sermons and eventually into theology journals, disguised as commentary on humility, how not every truth needs to be shown, only preserved. But those who understood its origin recognized it as something else, an acknowledgement that the Church's great fear had softened into care. The Codex was no longer an enemy of doctrine. It had become, in a quiet way, a participant, an artifact through which mystery reminded faith to remain gentle. When questioned by reporters in 2019, a Vatican spokesman offered the most measured answer possible. "The Holy See acknowledges the existence of manuscripts that resist full reproduction. These are not secrets. They are silences. We do not read them because they already read us." The remark circulated widely, quoted as poetic rather than official, but for those attuned to the Codex's long echo, it was enough. The Church had finally said aloud what it had practiced in private for centuries, that there are truths not meant to be solved, only accompanied. And somewhere in the vast stillness of the archive, under the hum of servers and the steady breath of climate control, the old chest remained sealed. The wax was long gone, the wood restored, the hinges polished. But those who passed its alcove claimed the air there always felt slightly warmer, as though a candle had been burning just moments before. It was not veneration anymore. It was coexistence. Faith and reason, theology and science, no longer opponents, merely two forms of listening. The Codex Somniis Dei had outlasted its censors not by defiance, but by patience. It had learned, perhaps better than anyone, that dreams do not vanish when forgotten. They wait until the listener is ready again. And now, at the edge of a new century, one question quietly crossed both laboratory and cloister. If the dream once spoke through ink and parchment, could it speak again through the rhythms of living minds? The Church would not say yes nor no. Only some texts guard themselves. When the news of the Vatican's quiet admission reached the scientific world, it was met not with scandal, but with curiosity. A manuscript that reads its observers, it sounded like metaphor, or perhaps a challenge waiting to be tested. Among those listening was Dr. Elias Navarro, a neurotheologian based in Granada, known for studying what he called the cartography of devotion, how faith mapped itself across the human brain. He had spent years recording the neural signatures of prayer. The moment a monk entered deep meditation, the pulse slowed, and the boundaries of self softened. He called those seconds the still room. Navarro had read Dr. Voss's research in his early career. He had followed her work on the Codex's Fibonacci rhythms, the entrainment of breath and sleep. Where she had measured coherence, he saw something closer to worship, a return to what ancient mystics called concordia luminis, the harmony of light. If sleep could synchronize minds across language, could prayer do the same across belief? He wrote to the Vatican's Custodes Silenti, requesting permission to conduct a joint study at the monastery of Camaldoli, deep in the Apennines. He proposed a simple experiment: measure the brain waves of monks as they prayed through the night, then compare them to the waveforms recorded during Dr. Voss's Codex rhythm tests. Weeks later, a single envelope arrived from Rome, marked with the seal of the sleeping lion. Inside, one sentence: permission granted, provided no questions are asked of the text. The monastery received him quietly. Its stone corridors carried the scent of cedar and wax. The hours moved according to bells, not clocks. The brothers welcomed him without curiosity. Hospitality was their vow, not conversation. They gave him a small cell with a wooden desk, a crucifix, and a view of the forest. When the first night came, he set up his instruments: EEG caps, pulse sensors, a recording device calibrated to catch frequencies too low for human hearing. The monks took their positions in the chapel, each kneeling in a pool of candlelight, eyes closed, lips moving in rhythm to psalms that had not changed in 1,000 years. At first, the readings were ordinary, alpha waves rising and falling like tide. But as the chanting deepened, a strange pattern began to emerge. Bursts of synchronized gamma activity, fleeting and symmetrical. It was rare, almost impossible for untrained meditators, but here it appeared across all subjects. Every monk, from the youngest novice to the abbot, entered the same rhythm at the same minute. Navarro compared the graphs and felt his pulse quicken. The waveform matched the spiral ratio described in the Codex, the same one Voss had traced through her experiments: 5, 8, 13, 21. The geometry of breath had become the geometry of faith. He noted it carefully, but the instruments recorded more than electrical coherence. The chapel microphones caught a subtle harmonic, a tone too low to be human. It resonated through the stone walls, a faint vibration that seemed to rise from the floor rather than the throats of the monks. At first he thought it feedback, but when he muted the devices, the tone remained, vibrating in the bones of the building. He remembered a phrase from Grimaldi's journal: time breathing through stone. After the prayer ended, the monks rose, bowed, and departed in silence. Navarro stayed behind, alone in the glow of candles guttering in their brass holders. On the recorder, the hum persisted even after everyone had left. He leaned closer to the waveform on his laptop. It pulsed in the same intervals as REM sleep. Prayer and dream had merged into one continuous state. He wrote in his notes, "Faith, it seems, is a form of waking sleep, a dream sustained by attention rather than surrender." Over the next weeks, he repeated the experiment. Every night, the same alignment. Every dawn, the same tone, fading just before the first bell rang for lauds. The monks offered no theories. When he asked the abbot if they ever felt the vibration, the man smiled gently. "The walls remember us," he said. "We only borrow their patience." When Navarro sent the results to Rome, the reply was brief: "Continue, but listen more than you measure." He began to do just that. The machines became secondary. He spent hours sitting in the chapel with no equipment, breathing with the rhythm of the monks, watching how the candlelight trembled in the drafts. He started to sense what the instruments had hinted at, that the chapel itself was participating, not echoing, but joining. He described it later as architecture made of listening. On his final night in Camaldoli, he dreamed that the Codex lay open on the altar, its pages blank. Only one line appeared as the candles flickered. When breath finds its mirror, the soul begins to speak. He woke to the sound of bells, feeling as though the dream had left something printed behind his eyes. Not words, but rhythm. The same slow pulse he had measured, now inside him. He would leave the monastery with enough data to fill volumes, but none of it mattered as much as that rhythm. He knew it could not be published without losing its grace. He also knew that the experiment was incomplete. The Codex's design was not a record of the divine. It was an invitation to breathe, to align, to remember the silence from which all voices rise. And so, when he returned to his lab, he began to plan a final experiment, one that would not measure monks or machines, but the rhythm of time itself. For if the walls could remember prayer, perhaps time could remember God. The night Navarro realized the candles themselves were pulsing, he thought at first it was fatigue. He had been staring too long, he told himself. The human eye invents rhythm when the mind expects it. But the metronome of wax and flame refused to align with chance. Each taper flickered not randomly, but in pattern. Slow swell, brief bow, return. Across 20 meters of chapel, flames moved as if carried by the same invisible breath. He placed a photometer on the altar rail and recorded for hours. When he played the data back in the morning, the light curve was unmistakable, a repeating series of intervals identical to the monk's chant tempo, down to the fraction of a second. When the psalms rose in pitch, the flames brightened. When voices descended into silence, the candles steadied into an even glow. He cross-referenced the readings with the EEG data from the previous night and found something impossible. The wavelengths of light and brainwave frequency harmonized. The chapel, the candles, and the bodies praying within it had entered a single system of rhythm. Navarro carried the photometer outside, tested it under electric light, under stars. Nothing repeated. Only within the chapel did the light behave like breath. He asked the abbot whether the candles were made differently, perhaps local beeswax, special oil. The abbot shook his head. "They are ordinary," he said, "but the air here is patient. It remembers how to listen." That phrase haunted him. He began thinking of faith as a kind of architecture, not of stone but of attention, an invisible geometry built by repetition. Just as dreams assemble their own logic out of fragments, prayer builds a framework where silence can hold meaning. He called it sleep's geometry. When he overlaid the chant intervals, candle fluctuations, and neural patterns into a single chart, the resulting spiral formed a perfect mandala, 9 rings turning inward to one still point. At the center of that mandala, he placed a small black dot, a reminder of the missing Codex. When he presented the findings at a conference in Florence, few believed him. The data looked too elegant, too synchronized. One physicist accused him of fitting the numbers to the legend. Navarro smiled. "Perhaps," he said, "but sometimes numbers volunteer to fit." Back at Camaldoli, the monks continued their midnight offices. He visited often, bringing new instruments, but eventually stopped turning them on. It was enough to sit and watch the rhythm reappear. Flame, breath, psalm, silence. He began to notice smaller symmetries, the swing of a censer echoing the motion of a pendulum, the way incense drifted in loops shaped like sine waves, the echo of footsteps arriving exactly between 2 verses. Every element, down to smoke and silence, moved as if choreographed by a single unseen metronome. He thought again of Dr. Voss's phrase, "the communion of sleepers." The monks were awake, yet their bodies followed the same pattern as dreamers. Prayer, it seemed, was organized dreaming, a shared lucid state in which intention replaced randomness. If dreams were humanity remembering God, then perhaps prayer was God remembering humanity. He wrote that sentence in his field notes and circled it twice. One morning before leaving, he asked the abbot if he might record a final chant. The old man agreed, but suggested something different. "Do not record us," he said. "Record the silence after we finish." Navarro did. He captured 2 minutes of stillness after the final Amen. When he analyzed the file later, he found faint waves hidden in the quiet, vibrations just below hearing, pulsing at the same frequency as the human heart at rest. Silence itself had joined the geometry. He published the work as a meditation rather than a paper. It circulated in small journals under the title The Pulse of Light, Notes Toward a Theology of Rest. The Vatican never commented, but a short note arrived months later, unsigned. Custodia confirmata, lucis mensura integra. The custody is intact. The measure of light remains whole. He pinned it above his desk and closed his research files. There was nothing left to prove. He had come looking for a text and found an anatomy instead. The way faith inhabits breath, how sleep imitates prayer, how the human pulse keeps the shape of forgotten scripture. The Codex no longer needed to be found. It had already moved into the rhythm of the living. And somewhere in Rome, beneath marble and silence, a librarian checked the sensors of a sealed chamber and noted a familiar pattern. A gentle rise in temperature every 90 seconds, faint but precise, like the breath of someone sleeping beneath the floor. The Vatican's archives stretch below Rome like the memory of the city itself. Corridors folding into corridors, centuries sealed in controlled air. Most visitors never pass the first gate, where modern light meets stone older than language. But there are rooms below even that. Places omitted from maps not out of secrecy, but because the hours there do not behave. Dr. Elias Navarro arrived with a quiet invitation. No escort, no letterhead, only a line of text waiting in his inbox the night before. Custodia temporis requirit oculos patientes. The custody of time requires patient eyes. He followed a curator through the narrow stairways until sound itself thinned. The click of shoes, the faint hum of lights, all swallowed by weight. The air changed texture, thicker, as though dust and temperature had learned to rest, rather than fall. At the final landing, the curator stopped before a heavy door of glass black stone. A small bronze plaque read, Archivum nulle horae, the archive of no hour. Then she left him there, without farewell. Inside, the chamber was modest, almost plain, a circular room with walls of polished basalt, no windows, no clocks. Rows of sealed cases ringed the perimeter, each illuminated by a soft, golden light that had no visible source. It was not bright enough to cast shadow, yet nothing remained unseen. In the center stood a single reading table. On it, a chair, and nothing else. Navarro set down his notebook and waited, unsure for what. The silence was not absence but presence, dense enough that even his breathing seemed foreign. After a few minutes, his watch began to behave oddly. Its second hand slowed, stuttered, then stopped altogether. He tapped the face. No response. He checked his pulse. It beat steadily. The fault was not in him. He thought of what the monks had said. The walls remember us. Perhaps time, too, remembered differently here. He walked the perimeter slowly, tracing the seams of each sealed case. Their catalog numbers were ordinary, centuries of inventory, but one stood blank, its brass tag polished smooth by handling. When he leaned closer, a faint reflection met his gaze. Not his face exactly, something older, expressionless, watching back. He blinked, the surface darkened. Returning to the table, he opened his notebook to check the clock app on his phone. No signal, no time. Only a blank white screen that dimmed in slow rhythm, brightening and fading like breath. He pressed the power button and whispered, half amused, Even the machines sleep here. He wrote that line in his notes, though later he would swear he had not written it at all, that the ink already waited there before his pen touched paper. He began recording observations, temperature, humidity, the faint vibration beneath his feet, as if machinery ran somewhere far below. Yet when he pressed his ear to the floor, the sound resembled not mechanics, but a heartbeat, slow, vast, and patient. The archivists called this phenomenon temporal neutrality. Clocks slowed, film exposures stretched, voices recorded here played back elongated, as if the air itself refused to hurry. Officially, it was a quirk of magnetic interference from the basalt foundation. Unofficially, it was known as the breathing of the vault. Navarro noticed something else. Every 12 minutes, though the measure was only instinctive, the light changed tone, sliding almost imperceptibly from gold to silver and back again. He remembered the REM cycles, the monks' chant intervals, the Fibonacci breathing of the Codex. The room's pulse was the same. He wrote in the margin, "The archive dreams at 90-second heartbeats." Then came a sound. Not a footstep, not the creak of a door, but a low sigh, like the settling of old parchment. He turned. Across the chamber, a soft glow emanated from the blank-tagged case. The light shimmered through the glass, thin as candle flame seen underwater. He approached slowly. Inside, barely visible, lay a single object wrapped in dark cloth, its shape more absence than form. When he leaned closer, the glass fogged slightly, as if from breath on the other side. He did not open it. Permission had not been granted. But the warmth on the glass pulsed in the same interval as his own heartbeat. For an instant, his reflection and the shape within aligned, two silhouettes breathing in sync. Then the light dimmed and the glass cleared. The object was still. He stepped back to the table, the stillness intact but altered, as though the room had adjusted to include him. He wrote his final note before leaving. "Time is not kept here. It is kept company." When the curator returned an hour later, though her watch read only 12 minutes, she asked if he had found what he came for. Navarro smiled. "I think," he said, "it found me." And as they climbed back toward daylight, he glanced once more at his wristwatch. The second hand resumed its motion, but slower than before, tracing not seconds but something more deliberate, as though it had learned patience from the chamber below. Back in his hotel room that evening, Navarro found that the rhythm of the archive would not leave him. The silence of that underground chamber had followed him up the stairs, across the courtyard, and even through the noise of traffic. He noticed it in small ways. The air conditioner's hum slowing, the lamp's flicker taking on the same golden-silver pulse he had seen below. When he tried to write, his pen moved in intervals, pausing every few lines as though waiting for breath. He looked at his watch. It ticked, but the measure had changed. 60 seconds no longer felt like a minute. It felt like a meditation, longer, softer. He realized with quiet awe that he no longer believed in hours. The word itself had grown mechanical, inadequate. Time now felt like a living tide, something that moved through him, not around him. He tried to describe it in his notes. Consciousness is not the traveler, it is the landscape. Eternity is not endless time, but the moment that forgets to end. That night he dreamed of the archive again, not as a place of stone and glass, but as a vast body of water, each shelf a wave, each manuscript a current. He floated weightless between them. When he reached the center, the water turned to air, and he realized he was breathing the same rhythm he had measured in the monks and candles. The dream spoke not in words, but in intervals, an ancient pulse that simply said, "You are being remembered." He woke before dawn. For a moment he could not tell if he had dreamed or returned. The light outside his window matched the archive's tone. Not bright, not dim, just eternal mid-morning. He opened his laptop, half expecting the screen to glow in the same rhythm, and it did. Each flicker of its sleep mode aligned with his own breathing. Machines, it seemed, had no choice but to mimic their maker's heart. Over the following days, his perception of time continued to loosen. Conversations stretched, silences thickened. He found that when he spoke slowly enough, others unconsciously matched his cadence. The rhythm was contagious, gentle, but absolute. He began to suspect that this was what the Codex had always intended, not to reveal content, but to tune perception, to align human consciousness with what faith once called eternity. He revisited his recordings from the monastery and the archive. When played together, the monk's chant and the room's vibration merged perfectly, the same spiral pattern looping every 90 seconds. Overlaying them produced a single tone, clear and resonant. It was neither musical nor mechanical. It sounded like breath. He replayed the track late into the night, eyes closed. Somewhere between waking and sleep, he saw again the circular room, the blank-tagged case, the shimmer within. But this time, the glass was gone. The object inside, once a shadow, now revealed itself as an open book whose pages turned without touch. No letters, only waves of light moving like ink underwater. As he watched, he understood without reading. The book was not written for humanity. It was written through it. Every dream, every prayer, every breath had been an ongoing annotation. We were the margins, not the text. He woke with a calm he had never known. Outside, the city stirred, bells tolling the hour. But for him, the sound no longer divided time. It united it. Each peal blended into the next, until the day became one long note. In his journal, he wrote the sentence that would later close his final lecture. Eternity is not infinite time. It is the rhythm that survives forgetting. He knew he would return to the archive again. Not to measure, not to prove, but to sit in that patient air where clocks surrender and thought dissolves into something vaster, quieter. He suspected that the Codex still waited there, not for discovery, but for recognition. Perhaps that was what the Vatican meant by some texts guard themselves. They protect us not from truth, but from our own haste in trying to possess it. That night, as he prepared to sleep, he left his phone on the bedside table. Its screen pulsed softly, fading in and out, like a living thing keeping time with his breath. He smiled at the thought and closed his eyes. The last thing he heard was the low hum of the room, a continuation of that same vast rhythm, time-breathing, quietly keeping him company. And beneath Rome, in the chamber without clocks, a faint light answered. The rhythm remained unbroken. It was never meant to be found again. That's what Navarro told himself as he boarded the early flight to Rome a year later, carrying only a small notebook and the recordings from Camaldoli. He had been invited, not officially, but through a message that bore no signature, only a seal he already knew: the sleeping lion. The email subject line read simply, Nona Visio, the ninth vision. The Vatican's invitation was not a summons. It was an allowance. When he arrived, a young archivist met him at the gate, carrying a lantern instead of a badge. No words were exchanged. The gesture was older than language. He followed her through corridors he did not remember, though part of him suspected he had always been walking toward this moment. In the chamber of the Archivum Nullae Horae, the air felt different. The hum beneath the floor had softened, as if the room was breathing more slowly. The curator gestured toward the central table. There, wrapped in dark cloth, rested the object he had once seen only through glass. The cloth opened like dusk, revealing dawn. Before him lay a book smaller than he expected, bound in cracked leather blacker than ink. Its edges shimmered faintly, as if each page absorbed the light that fell upon it. The cover bore a single Latin phrase, faint but legible: De Somniis Dei, the dreams of God. No one spoke. He reached out, fingertips brushing the surface. It was cool, not like paper, more like the skin of polished stone. The archivist nodded once, a silent permission. When he opened the book, he found not words but impressions, indentations left by vanished ink. He tilted the pages toward the golden light. For a breathless instant, characters appeared, not written but remembered, lines shimmering as though pulled from deep memory. He began to trace them, whispering their Latin beneath his breath. The first full sentence formed slowly, line by line, as though the book required the rhythm of human speech to awaken. Cum Deus dormivit. Homo factus est somnium ius. When God slept, man became his dream. He read on, and the next phrase unfolded like revelation. Et cum homo meminit, Deus evigilat in cord. And when man remembers, God awakens in the heart. The archivist closed her eyes, whispering along, though she had never seen the text before. The translation came not as language but as understanding, a shared clarity moving through both of them. The Codex, it seemed, spoke in cognition, not in sound. Every paragraph described creation not as act, but as recurrence. God did not create once. He dreamed continuously. Reality was not the dream's outcome. It was the dream itself, echoing in cycles of awareness. The text explained that consciousness was God's method of remembering himself, and that memory was divine participation. It said simply, when the Creator dreams, we awaken. When we dream, he remembers. As Navarro read, the rhythm he had carried since the monastery returned, the 90-second pulse, the slow alternation of gold and silver in the light. The pages seemed to move slightly beneath his hand, like breathing parchment. At one point, he realized that the letters had begun to mirror themselves, the left page reflecting the right in perfect symmetry, until both sides formed a single image, a circle made of sentences. At its center, one final line glowed faintly. Memoria Dei est lumen somni hominis. The memory of God is the light of man's dream. The archivist exhaled softly. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hum with the same resonance Navarro had once recorded in the monastery chapel. Not sound, but vibration, the sense that meaning itself had weight. He understood, then, what the Codex had been guarding. It was not doctrine, it was not prophecy, it was a mirror, a reflection of consciousness looking back at its source. The text did not explain the divine, it enacted it. Each reading was an act of creation, the book completing itself through whoever dared to open it. As the final lines faded, he noticed the ink dissolve back into the page, as though satisfied with its brief remembering. When he tried to turn the last leaf, it resisted, cool and unyielding. He let it close. The rhythm slowed, the light dimmed, and then silence, thick, whole, alive. He did not speak for a long time. The archivist finally whispered, "It doesn't teach, does it?" He shook his head. "No," he said. "It remembers." They rewrapped the Codex, the cloth now warm to the touch. Before leaving, He placed his hand on the stone table and felt, faintly, that same slow heartbeat beneath it. He understood. It was not the book alone that dreamed. It was the entire archive. The Codex was simply the voice. As they left the chamber, the air shifted again. Somewhere deep in the stone, he thought he heard the faint sound of pages turning by themselves, unhurried, endless. Perhaps it was imagination. Or perhaps, as the text had said, memory had begun to awaken. Outside, the night of Rome shimmered with rain, the cobblestones glistening like pages of wet parchment. The bells of St. Peter's struck the hour, though Navarro could not tell which one. He smiled faintly. In a world that now breathed with him, time had become irrelevant. The Codex had not answered the question of God. It had rewritten the question entirely. If creation was a dream, then perhaps belief itself was not an act of faith, but of remembering, an agreement between sleeper and dreamer. And for the first time, he felt no divide between the two. In the days after the reading, Navarro moved through Rome as though walking inside the residue of a dream that had not yet chosen to end. Sounds arrived slower. Streets felt deeper. Even his reflection in shop windows seemed to lag by a heartbeat, as if the world were politely waiting for him to catch up. He stayed in a small apartment overlooking the Tiber, the same river that had once carried the ashes of heretics and saints alike. At dawn, the light drifted across his desk in smooth waves, gold at first, then pale blue, the same breathing pattern of the archives chamber. He began writing without intention, not to publish, not even to remember. The sentences came by themselves, as if someone else were thinking through him. The dreamer and the dream are mirrors trading places, he wrote. When consciousness imagines God, it is God recalling consciousness. He paused, reread the line, and felt the subtle pulse return. 5, 8, 13, 21, the Fibonacci of being. The Codex's rhythm was no longer confined to parchment. It had moved into thought. Every idea unfolded in spirals, returning to its origin with more light than before. He began comparing his old field notes, the candle pulses at Camaldoli, the synchronized REM waves, the vibration of the archive floor. They all described one phenomenon under different names: resonance. It was as if every layer of existence, from stone to soul, was tuned to the same harmonic scale. And that scale, he realized, was the language the Codex had always spoken, the divine dialect of repetition. Not command, not decree, echo. That night he dreamed of the chamber again. Though this time it was not sealed, he saw hundreds of people walking its circular path: monks, scientists, poets, ordinary strangers. Each carried a small flame, and as they breathed, the air shimmered with slow pulses of light. At the center stood the book, open, its pages reflecting the glow of every candle into one vast halo. When he leaned closer, he saw that the text was no longer Latin. It was in their gestures, the nodding of heads, the synchronized breath, the shared silence. The Codex had migrated from language to motion. It had become a rhythm of being. He woke before dawn and went walking through the empty streets. The city seemed alive with quiet intelligence. The dome of St. Peter's outlined in silver fog, pigeons spiraling above it like fragments of a broken halo. He thought of how the dream mirrored creation itself, endless layers of consciousness observing one another. For the first time he understood what Benedict XIV must have sensed when he ordered the Codex sealed. Not fear, but recognition. He had seen that the text did not describe God. It was God, refracted through human memory. Every act of observation completed the loop. Every reader became co-author. The divine did not speak from beyond. It spoke from within, each mind translating a small portion of the same sentence. And perhaps that was the secret. The Codex was never a revelation to humanity. It was humanity revealing itself to God. He returned to his apartment and placed his hands flat on the desk, feeling the wood's faint warmth. He closed his eyes and waited until the rhythm steadied. The same slow alternation of gold and blue light he had measured beneath the archive. He whispered to the empty room, "If he dreamed us, then every thought is a prayer back toward waking." The thought carried no theology, only tenderness. He realized how much of the world's conflict came from forgetting that we were all part of the same dreaming, different minds echoing one eternal breath. The monks had understood it. So had Voss in her frequencies. Even the candles had known it, flickering in measured accord. The Codex had not invented truth. It had only reminded the world of its own coherence. In the final pages of his journal, Navarro wrote, "To read the Codex is to watch yourself being written. You turn the page, and the page turns you." He mailed those notes to a friend in Zurich with a small instruction. "If I do not return, publish this as fiction. Truth requires gentleness to survive." That evening, as he sat by the window, rain began again. The same rhythmic rain that had greeted him after the first reading. Each drop struck the glass in intervals that matched the Codex's breath. For a moment, he imagined that the city itself was dreaming, the Tiber breathing through its bridges, the bells keeping tempo with the rain. Every clock tower was an eyelid slowly closing, and somewhere beneath it all, in the sealed chamber of no hour, the Codex breathed too, pages stirring in rhythm with the sleeping city above. Each pulse a reminder, each silence an invitation. The dreamer and the dream were now inseparable. What God had once dreamed was dreaming back. The letter reached Zurich 2 months later, by which time Navarro had already disappeared from public life. His last confirmed sighting was in a small antiques shop near Piazza Navona, asking quietly whether anyone still sold optical glass with memory. The shopkeeper remembered his politeness, the way he smiled when shown a set of silver-backed mirrors from the 18th century. He bought one and left no address. Weeks passed before anyone understood what he'd meant. Among his belongings, a parcel arrived for Dr. Clara Voss, the neuroscientist who had once argued that dreams were the brain's method of rehearsing creation. Inside was the mirror, wrapped in black linen, and a small note. "Do not look for words. Look for what waits to see you back." At first, the mirror appeared ordinary, slightly tarnished, its surface dappled with age. But when she placed it under laboratory light, faint lines appeared, vanishing the moment she turned away. They were not scratches, nor etching. They were impressions, like the memory of handwriting. She angled the light differently, recalling Navarro's notes on alternating wavelengths, gold to silver, silver to gold. When she matched the rhythm, the markings resolved into letters, not printed, but hovering just beneath the glass, as if reflected from somewhere unseen. The text was fragmented, yet coherent enough to recognize. Passages from the Codex de Somniis Dei. Words she knew Navarro had read in the archive, now emerging through reflection rather than ink. She tried photographing them, but the camera caught nothing. Only in direct observation, when a human eye met its own reflection, did the text appear. It was a mirror that required witness to exist. She read aloud what little she could. The dream remembers the dreamer, and the page recalls the hand that turned it. Each sentence faded the moment it was spoken, replaced by another, different, yet resonating with the same cadence, the same meaning wearing new forms. It was as though the mirror translated itself to whoever stood before it, adapting its language to the observer's understanding. Faith had become physics. When she invited colleagues to test it, most saw nothing. Only those who had experienced profound loss or awe reported any visible words. One described it as reading with the heart instead of the eyes. Another wept quietly, saying the glass had shown her childhood handwriting, a prayer she thought she'd forgotten. Dr. Voss began keeping the mirror covered when not in use, sensing that exposure wore it down, like a muscle overused. She noted that every session shortened the time the text remained visible, as if the mirror were teaching its users to remember without depending on it. Perhaps that was the point. Revelation meant to dissolve itself. Her final experiment came late one night. Alone in the lab, she uncovered the mirror and whispered Navarro's phrase, "When God dreamed man, he became memory." For an instant, the entire surface shimmered, not with words, but with light, pulsing in a rhythm she recognized at once. 90 seconds of breath, gold fading to blue, then back again. She leaned closer. Her reflection dissolved, replaced by an image of the circular archive chamber, the same basalt walls, the same invisible glow. At its center, the Codex lay open, turning its own pages. On the last page, a faint reflection of her own face looked up, smiling gently. Then the glass darkened. She switched off the light. In the dark, she could still feel it pulsing, slow, patient, eternal. Somewhere beneath the Vatican, the Codex was dreaming again, this time through her. By dawn, the laboratory was quiet. The mirror lay on the table, veiled once more beneath its dark cloth, as though asleep after some enormous effort. Dr. Voss sat beside it, watching the pale light seep through the window, muted, steady, indifferent to discovery. For the first time, she felt no urge to record or measure. The experiment was over. Or perhaps it had never been an experiment at all, only a continuation of something older remembering its own rhythm. She opened Navarro's final note again, the ink beginning to fade into the paper like breath cooling on glass. Dreams are the rehearsal of creation. We wake each morning not to begin the world, but to remind it that it still exists. She looked at the mirror one last time. The outline beneath the cloth seemed to pulse faintly, in time with her heartbeat. And for a moment, she thought she heard it exhale. Not a sound exactly, more a release of meaning, like a sigh from a page closing itself. Outside, Rome was stirring awake. Bells rang across the river, overlapping in uneven intervals that somehow made perfect sense. Voss stepped out onto the balcony and watched the sun rise behind the Vatican dome. The light moved slowly, gold over stone, as if the city itself were blinking open from a long and gentle dream. She thought of the Codex, of the monks and their rhythmic candles, of Navarro's trembling handwriting. Time is not kept here. It is kept company. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe waking was not escape from sleep, but its fulfillment. The moment the dream learns, it has a witness. Maybe God never stopped dreaming. Maybe he only waited for someone to notice the breath between seconds. She turned back to the room. The mirror was quiet, dark, but on the window pane, the reflection of the sunrise briefly formed letters, just 3 words, before dissolving back into light. You are memory. She smiled and let the glass go transparent again. The world beyond it was already enough. The sound of footsteps below, the smell of wet stone, the rhythm of life continuing its patient pulse. The Codex had not changed history. It had only reminded her that history, like dream, was never truly past. It waited in every heartbeat to be remembered. That night, as the city's lights shimmered across the river, a soft wind moved through the open window. It brushed against the covered mirror, lifting the corner of the cloth just enough to reveal a faint glow beneath. The rhythm was still there, steady, timeless, alive, and somewhere far below, in the chamber of no hour, a librarian closed his ledger, noting a simple line, Codex Benedicti. Status: awake. The story of the Black Codex of Benedictus does not end. It never could. Because if creation is God's dream, then every thought, every breath, every act of remembering continues it. The pages turn through us now. And maybe, just maybe, the question was never whether God still dreams. It's whether we're listening closely enough to notice that we are part of it. So tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself, if you could ask one question in a dream, knowing it would be answered, what would you ask? Leave your answer below. Because somewhere, in the rhythm between waking and sleep, something might be listening.